So one of the things that does keep coming up in my research is that there seems to be often in some of these oldest companies and organizations a person who tells the stories and connects the generation to generation within companies and organizations. In some places that's highly cultivated, like the temples in Japan, but in some places it's very informal, and sometimes it's a parent of a founder, or even in some cases like a janitor who's been there for decades and tells the stories of how certain things survived in the past. And sometimes they're the person that remembers the last plague or the last war and can remind current management what they did during that time in order to weather it. Or if the management is, let's say, proposing a new project, this person might remind them, oh, you know what, we tried that and it really didn't work. And maybe it could work now with new tools and a new time, but here's why it didn't work then. And so many of these institutions kind of have this person. And I think one of the places that I found that it's interestingly very formalized is in some of the cathedrals in Europe, like Salisbury Cathedral, which has been around for over 800 years. And they have a person there whose title is called the Keeper of the Fabric, which is kind of my favorite title for these type of people. They have roles of keeping track of the finances and basic administrative tasks, but they also have this role of really kind of bridging generational conversations. And in fact, I think what's interesting about the Salisbury Cathedral is that the oldest continuously operating clock is the tower clock that's in that cathedral. And that Keeper of the Fabric's one of their jobs is to help make sure these things are maintained between some of the wars and difficult financial times or technical failures that it has to recover from. We might imagine how keepers of the fabric could be cultivated in the institutions that we have in the world to help them last. These keepers of the fabric can, in some cases, mean the difference between life and death. An amazing counterexample to the very first one I started this talk with are the Sentinelese tribes of the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. And these tribes are small, a few thousand people, but they have had these kind of keepers of the fabric to tell oral traditional stories over as many as, I think, what we now know to be about 60,000 years. Their island was heavily affected by the 2004 tsunami off the coast of Indonesia that wiped out huge chunks of modern culture. And when the anthropologist arrived at this largely fishing kind of sustenance village, assuming that it was going to be wiped out in these islands, they found them totally intact. And they asked them, how did you survive this tsunami? And they said, this is a tribe that's been on these islands for over 60,000 years, an African diaspora tribe for 60,000 years. And they have a totally oral storytelling tradition that's helped along by shamans and chiefs and storytellers within their communities that said when the water recedes, just like it does in a normal wave cycle, that it's always going to come back in at least an equal amount. And so when they saw the water receding during the antecedent to the last tsunami, they ran for the hills. Whereas you saw people in modern day Bangladesh and Indonesia standing on the beach with cell phones, filming the water going out, not thinking that it was going to have this reciprocal effect. So it was this very old knowledge, these keepers of the fabric that helped save life, save property, save culture over time. And I think the question is, who are the keepers of our fabric? I think private organizations and religions, interestingly, kind of have these more than others. I think a lot of our cultural institutions, like libraries and museums, are kind of hit and miss on this. Governments generally are pretty bad at this, but we can imagine that we certainly want government data like birth and death records, government data from the World Health Organization from this pandemic to the next. We want that information to survive. I think the last example I'll give is of a good example and the story of kind of a hero of the keeper of the fabric who was unappreciated in his time in another city in Japan. And it was a 10-term mayor in this city who was dead long before the last big tsunami. And he actually pulled together government resources and funding to build this actually fairly ugly, massive 51-foot seawall pretty high in a city that's pretty far away from the ocean, much further away than other ones were. And he was ridiculed and told that, that this was a waste of money and that it didn't look good. And this seawall was closed just in time to save the city from the last tsunami, well, as cities all around it who had only built, seawalls that were 30 feet tall, were wiped out. In fact, those seawalls basically helped keep the water in once the water came over them. And it was because this mayor had cultural memory from the stories that were told to him by his elders, and he kept it relevant. He had enough power within government and respect and length in government to build something that nobody else would ever have the kind of cultural power and social power and economic power to do. So we can all, I think, take these examples and try and figure out what institutions we want to last for a long time, what is the type of information that we want to last for a long time, and who are we going to have within these institutions, and how are we going to empower them to be the keepers of the fabric, to make sure that we survive the difficulties of the calamities that we might live through, and more than that, really thrive and have a civilization that can last in the next 10,000 years, hopefully better than we have in the last 10,000 years.